Okay, so let's start with the talk of Professor Raj Sethuraman. So I assume that all of you know perfectly who is Raj Sethuraman, but I would like to give some words, to say some aspects related to his bio. So this is a short version of his vita, okay? So Raj Sethuraman is the Marilyn and Leo Corrigan Endowed Professor and Chair of Marketing at the Edwin L. Cox School of Business at Southern Methodist University. He received his MBA from Indian Institute of Management in Calcutta and his PhD in Marketing from Kellogg School of Management at Northwestern University. Dr. Sethuraman teaches marketing research, customer insights, and database marketing courses at the Cox School of Business. He has written many cases in marketing management and introduced several online teaching tools for which he was awarded the Eugene Byrne Teaching Innovation Award in May 2010. Professor Sethuraman's research focuses on applying economic models and econometric methods to address substantive problems related to marketing mix strategies in the consumer packaged goods industry. He has published articles in several journals, including the Journal of Marketing Research, Marketing Science, and Management Science. He has also won many research awards, including the John D.C. Little Award for the Best Paper in Marketing Science, the Hadish Shet Award for the Best Paper in the Journal of the Academy of Marketing Science, the Odile Award for the Best Paper in the Journal of Marketing Research, runner-up, the William R. Davidson Award for the Best Paper in Journal of Retailing, second place, and the Paul Green Award for the Best Paper in Journal of Marketing Research, finalist, and the Research Excellence Award at the Cox School of Business. Many of his works have been listed in Social Science Research Network's top 10 downloads, all-time hits in marketing. He serves on the editorial boards of Marketing Science, Journal of Retailing, Journal of Modeling in Management, and Review of Marketing Science. His research has been cited widely in the Wall Street Journal and other business media. Dr. Sethuraman is also active in consulting for commercial and non-profit organizations. His recent consulting engagements include Samsung Telecommunications, KPMG, Pitt Marwick Law Firm, and the Center for Non-Profit Management. He's also the founder, president of Charity Through Art Foundation, a non-profit organization dedicated to raising money for the underprivileged by organizing art events. So this is the short version, okay? So, yeah, it's too long. So I would like to thank Professor Raj because he has made a great effort for being here. He arrived yesterday afternoon from Dallas, and he leaves tomorrow morning. So thank you very much for being here with us, and thank you for this talk. Thank you, Raj.
Even though I'm in Dallas, thank you, Yuan and Paco, for organizing this. You probably didn't want to hear the same speaker twice on the same day. That's why I wore my jacket this time, just to differentiate myself. But as Yuan said, I have to leave tomorrow for another conference and that weekend. So I'm here just for a day, so I thought I'll do the best I can. This is, even though I live in the United States, I'm, as you know from my name and my looks, that I'm from India. And Indian, like many countries, has a long culture and history and rich traditions. One of the traditions is what's called Guru Sishya Parampara, which is, Guru, as you know, has become a common English word, which means the teacher. And Sishya means disciple. So in those days, there were no conferences. There were no emails. And those days, I'm talking about 3,000 years ago. And so the Guru used to verbally teach the Sishya, pass on the wisdom that he had acquired or she had acquired. And the other person, the Sishya, when he became Guru, passed on to his disciple and so forth. So, in that same vein, even though this is at a conference, what I have learned from my gurus in research, what I've imbibed, at least some of them, I want to pass on to you. You're not my disciples, but at least I know you're younger than most of you or all of you are younger to me. And at least someone asked, so are you working on private? I said, maybe I'm the oldest researcher on private labels in this conference because I've worked on it for at least 30 years now. So I want to pass on some of what I have learned from my gurus so that we can, and I don't, even though it is going to be a talk on my gurus, I was trying to say, okay, maybe at last you probably won't hear private labels, but because I worked on private labels, you'll probably hear more of private labels. And some of the papers that were quoted in this conference by many of you, I will talk about how at least some of them that I'm associated with, how it developed and what I learned from working with my co-authors on that paper. So the title of my talk there is a little different. My co-authors as research role models. Then I learned something, not necessarily from my gurus, that if you put a colon in the title, the chance of publishing that paper increases by 30%. So I've got another title with a colon. My co-authors as research role models, sharing some pearls of wisdom I've obtained over the last 30 years. And you may recognize some of these gurus of mine. Some of you are not old enough to know that these people some were and some are really famous. And Yuan introduced me as a PhD from Kellogg Graduate School of Management, Northwestern. So I'm going to start with the very first person on the left. Does anybody recognize who that is? Philip Kotler. Do you know who the second person is? He is Professor Deepak Jain. I'll talk about third person. Anybody knows? Jerry Tellis. That says Jagmohan Raju. This person is very also Sinu Srinivasan. And the last one is still my colleague, Roger Kiran. So I'm going to talk about how I came to be associated with these 6 people and what I learned from them just briefly. So let me start taking you back to about 30 years. I was a paying guest. I was in Mumbai, working in Mumbai. I was, in my former life, a chemical engineer. So I wanted to work in the chemical industry, so I joined Esso or Exxon Chemicals. Mumbai is a very expensive place. I had a small room in one of the houses where they sublet. They were living there, and they just gave me one room. And one of the days, my landlady comes to my receptionist and says, Raj has a telegram. So they thought something was wrong. My family, someone died, or maybe worse, I did something wrong and got somebody in a situation that I shouldn't. So we come running down, and it actually, those days there were no emails or texts. It was a telegram from Philip Kotler. This was March 1984, and it said, congratulations, you've been admitted. Now, Philip Kotler, some of you may know who he is, but he is considered the guru of modern marketing. He wrote the very first book. If you go back to the history of marketing, and we were talking about it in some of the informal meetings, a guy called Roe Alderson in 1950s wrote the very first piece on the philosophy or structure of marketing. Until then, economists and sociologists and psychologists ruled. They said there is no such thing as marketing. What we do is what one group understands consumer, the other group understands distribution, so there's no need for marketing. So Alderson brought this together and said marketing is really about logistics and supply chain and distribution. At that time, even they didn't think in terms of, marketing as consisting of strategic things that we have to look at to deliver the product to the consumer at the right place, right time, and so forth. So this person, he's actually an economist from MIT. And in 1964, he wrote the first textbook on marketing, which is now in its 15th edition and is still the best-selling marketing textbook. It's more like, many of you probably are using that, or now he has it with Kotler and Keller version of it. So he's very intense, very listy, but one of the first thinkers of marketing. He's about 85 years old, he's still at Northwestern. But later I found out he didn't even know this telegram was sent on his behalf. But they were using it because they knew Philip Kotler is a name that everybody recognizes. So I was jumping with joy, thinking I got a telegram from Philip Kotler. But it was, more importantly, though, his was in fall of September 1984. His was the first seminar I attended at Northwestern. And they also put him as so I say he's my first advisor. But that was just for the name. He didn't have time. He was so busy. He was so much on demand. Of course, he listened to us. And so in his first seminar, he was talking about the 4 Ps. That was introduced by a person called Eugene McCarthy in 1966. 1964, Kotler writes a book, 1966. The 4 Ps, and a lot of people have tried to kill that just so they get their own things. 5 Cs, 6, whatever it is. But still, this has stood the test of time. Product, price, place, promotion, you should be able to say in your sleep. I tell my students any time. And that has been for the most part. So Kotler wanted to be one up on McCarthy. So he introduced a 5th P called power. He said, there must be a 5th P. And the point at that time was, this was late 80s. And that was when a lot of developing countries were accepting people from developed. So Hyundai and Toyota were trying to get into India. There were a lot of joint ventures with Eastern European countries and stuff. So he said, in this play, the title was called Mega Marketing. He said, if you wanted to sell big products to big companies or big government agencies, then you must have a big P. And that was power. And he said power not in the sense of taking a gun and telling them you better buy my product, but power in the sense of saying we will employ 1,000 of your labor. In fact, Toyota just moved to Dallas from California because they said we will do this, and improve your economy. Power in terms of improving the local economy, or power in terms of saying that we will develop other things that may not be related to your own product line. In fact, Pepsi, when it entered India, in fact, that's the example that he gives. When it entered India, they didn't go into soft drinks. They actually went in and developed the agricultural part of it so that they can get an in with them on soft drinks. So soft drinks was a very protected market. So the point is, when he wrote that paper, that was his first seminar. He gave it to all of us and said, why don't you critique it? And then we were flabbergasted. I mean, here we were, poor PhD students who had no clue about what marketing is. And here he is, the guru of marketing. And he said, no, tell me all that is. And that's what some of what has happened here. All that you think is right or wrong. Because ultimately, the reader is not going to have the kind of intellectual power or the kind of knowledge base that I have. The reader is people like you who are just being interested in marketing. So we decided to go. In fact, I totally critiqued it. I said, this is not a good paper at all. And he listened to it carefully. I don't know if he agreed with me on that. Some he didn't. He agreed, some he didn't. But later on, it was published in the Harvard Business School as mega marketing. And you can see on the responsibilities of some non-marketing, argues the marketer should feel comfortable using power to accomplish these purposes. He called it, and mega marketing was popular for some time, then it kind of died. People said it was. But the point was, and these are the things that I learned in the very first thing that I worked with him, that constructive criticism is the only way we know how to publish quality articles. There may be other models, and that's the first introduction to research. You should always seek out constructive criticism, and you should treat them as constructive criticism. And the second one that I learned early on from him is constructive criticism. So feel free to criticize my papers, or even though I'm older in that sense, or my talk in that sense of, because that is the only way we know in academics to improve or sustain the quality of the materials that we produce. Then 2 years later, you couldn't recognize some of this. He is really smart person. I was a student at Northwestern. He just graduated from University of Texas at Dallas, and he's one of the few who finished PhD in 3 years. Actually, he could have finished in 2 years. That's how, but he was doing coaching other students for a year so he can make some money. And he is a PhD in 1996, and a very meteoric rise, very quickly. So in 4 years, it's very unusual. At Kellogg, which is a very demanding school, in 8 years, he became a full chaired professor. He went on to become the dean of Kellogg, and then he was in France, actually. He was the dean of INSEAD in France. Then he developed a certain brain tumor, you would say. So he went back to Kellogg, and the Queen of Thailand came to interview him and take him to Sassoon, where Sassoon and Kellogg have a joint venture. And they were so impressed that she came to Chicago, where he was, and invited him to become the dean. So he's the only person who has been dean of schools in 3 different continents. Okay. But when you look at him, you would probably not make out a difference between him and any guy on the street selling hot dogs. That's how simple. And he doesn't drink, eat, or meat. He doesn't speak. Someone was saying, I have bro. His English is not that good either. Half the time he mixes with the local language called Hindi. 80% of his English is Hindi. And he sleeps less than 5 hours. Sometimes when I work with him, I'm at 12 o'clock, he's working, and then I go to bed, and then at 5 o'clock, I'm trying to go to the bathroom, and then he's already up and working on the, boy, he says, I don't sleep more than 4 to 5 hours. One doesn't have to be, that doesn't have to be a role model. But the last one, he doesn't even drive a car. He's the only person I know in US who doesn't know how to drive a car. He still doesn't drive a car. But the point is, because he didn't know drive a car, I was his driver. I was his PhD student and his chauffeur. So a lot of times, just while driving him, we used to talk. And he always kept asking the question, what research? Raj, what research are you working on? Tell me what topic. So we'll talk about that. Sometimes I make up some research because I run out of ideas. Can I help with your thesis? And can we do? He's always wanting to work on some papers together. And so we did. And one of the people in this presentation showed this Shugan's 1980. I don't know who that was. Oh, was it yours? Steve Shugan's 1980 paper on the cost of thinking. And I'm trying to see, after I saw this, I said, oh, there's maybe a way to apply cost of thinking to national brand, store brand purchase. This was a very thoughtful, purely conceptual piece, which was, I think, a runner-up for the Ferber Award for the best paper in Journal of Consumer Research. It's not, the whole point was, if you can identify the components of thinking. So if I'm looking at a brand, I want to see whether I want to buy that product, I have to read the label. Then I have to compare it with some other label. Then I have to compute some things as to 10 minus 2, and then I have to make the decision. So he tried to quantify each of them and develop models as to, or he didn't develop model. He said it is possible to quantify and develop models that would both predict what search process people will use, and therefore what choice they will eventually end in. So I use that. So it's like people looking at two and then deciding what to read, the components of that. It applies both to grocery products and non-grocery products. So I use that to model, predict when people will process by brand, which means they'll take a brand and read all of the attributes, what's its calorie content, what's its sugar content, and so forth. Then if they think that's not for us, they go to the next brand and read all the labels. That is one way to do it. The attribute processing is they will take one brand, like in this case, miles per gallon. They will read miles per gallon across all brands. Choose those which pass what their miles per gallon is or sugar content is. Then among those brands, they'll process the next attribute. So this brand processing versus attribute processing is a very two important ways to analyze. And depending on what processing approach you use, you actually come up with different brands that you eventually decide what search process you use. So we wanted to theoretically predict, and I'm not going to go through any of this, but as to when it will be, so I told you that cost of thinking component, those are A's and B's and so forth, and the probability that something will fail on an attribute. So it's a probabilistic model. So I showed this to Deepak and say, I've got a lot of analytical work done, so we can write a paper. And he said, none of this makes sense because you have not told me what you want to achieve with it. And this is 2 years into the PhD program, so those things are pretty new. And even here, sometimes they say, okay, what is exactly the problem that is being addressed? And what is the solution you're trying to? And this is a technical thing. He said, he asked me how I'm going to get the results. I said, it's a very complicated model. I'm going to run simulation. He said, simulation is not a good thing to get results. At least for one of them, even for a simple case, make sure that you get it analytically. That's a side technical thing. So we decided to develop a model that will predict when people will use attribute processing and when people will use brand processing and how that will modify what brand you choose. And now I'm thinking maybe I will extend this model or run some experiment to see how people search for information, whether it affects their choice of national brand or store brand. So that's something that I'm thinking about, partly because I'm more of an empirical researcher, so I don't do behavioral work, but that might be one interesting. I do want to publish in JCR or JCP. So, but this was one of the first papers. This was a lead article, first papers published in JCP. JCP at that time was relatively new. So we actually sent it to management science. Management science was considered a very quantitative journal, but they wanted to give it a behavioral flavor. So they hired two editors, Steve Hoke and another guy who's at UC Berkeley now, I forget his name. So they hired them as special editors for this. So we sent it to them, and they said, no, we can't understand head or tail of this. So we ended up sending it to Journal of Consumer Psychology, which was a new journal at that time. It was introduced only in 1991, and we were one of the first to publish that. The first publication came in 1992, but that's not the point. The point I learned from Deepak soon enough is when you're even starting to do the research, you must have an end game in mind. Now, eventually, that may not be the end game that you settle on, but you must have a game plan that says, this is what eventually I want to achieve, okay, in terms of, or I want to investigate. And this is what, if the investigation turns out to be this way, this is what can happen. So think about the destination even when you start. And this is, as I said, just have solid proofs of. The third one that I wanted to was, again, 2 years later, I joined University of Iowa. He was a professor there. I call him the master positioner, Jerry Tellis. He was, the context in which we joined together to do that was based on my thesis. And I was telling some people, I was motivated by another guru. I didn't work with him. He spent only a year or two. He went on to become the executive director of Marketing Science Institute when I was a PhD student. So I didn't get to work with him. His name is Lou Stern. Some of you may know who he is. He wrote what I think is a classic paper on private labels in 1966. And at that time, private labels, nobody really cared. As our private labels is generic brands, it's got 1 to 2% market share. Nobody cares about it. But he said the emergence of private labels is going to take off very soon. And his title was The New World of Private Brands. And then I saw that paper and I said, oh, this is a great, that's how I got to working on private labels from 1986 or so, and since that time. And so I was telling some people I'm hoping to write a 50 years of private labels research treatise starting with when Lou Stern introduced that, 1966. Today Jacqueline was talking about 1969 paper by Bush. Those were some of the times when private labels was a totally different ball game compared to what it is now. From 1966 to 2016 is what I want to cover in my book, what academic research has contributed. But in my thesis, it was very simple. I had analytical model that said private labels will flourish in price-sensitive markets, but not in advertising-sensitive markets. It was a fairly standard view of private labels, that private labels are lower priced, but unadvertised brands. So naturally, people who are price sensitive but not advertising sensitive will go for that product. So I collected data on price elasticity and advertising elasticity, something that I still work on. And at the same time, Tellis became famous for his meta-analysis article in 1988, where he predicted that price elasticity is negative 1.76. Advertising elasticity is 0.22. We just wrote a paper addressing that in JMR, which is one of the papers that was a runner-up for an award. And so price elasticity is 8 times the advertising elasticity. So his recommendation was cut back on, do more price promotion and less advertising. And everybody, the advertising agency got really riled up about it. So how can you say that? And so the Simon Broadbent is very big advertising supporter. He said it's silly, almost stupid to compare price elasticity and advertising elasticity. They're just two different measures. So it's like comparing apples and oranges. So I had data on price elasticity, advertising elasticity, and here he was in the center of a controversy. Sometimes these are the things that make people start to work together. These are just coincidence or happenstance. So I said, well, I can analytically tell you how many oranges make an apple. And if we can do that, then we can compare, have a good way of comparing price elasticity to advertising elasticity. So we developed a model and derived, so we said, suppose you advertise a product without price cut. Suppose you price cut with no advertising. Compute the profits, and then we computed the profit equivalent. That has become a very good way of comparing different marketing instruments. It's called PEMI, profit equivalent of marketing impact. So if you do this marketing action A, marketing B, marketing action C, what is the profit equivalent of, how much should you do of this, A, for matching the profits that you will get from B? Of course, certain assumptions have to be made because we do margins and stuff. So we showed exactly how the ratio of price to advertising elasticity will help in determining how much advertising is needed to match 1% or 10% price discount. So we analytically derived that and we meta-analyzed. Okay. These days, you have a much better chance of publishing. The ideal publishing world is theory, empirical work, implication. If you have all three of them in good order, then the chances of publishing in a good journal are very high. So we did this, and we did meta-analyze the ratio of price to advertising elasticity. But I don't think if I had written it myself at that time, it would have been published, or it would have. This was another paper that was a finalist for the award. So I don't want to read that, but once I did all the analysis and all the analytical model, he helped a little bit. He said, get away, that's it. I will write the first 2 pages. And that's how he makes it come alive. He sees what is there and he says, I know exactly how to position this paper in terms of the literature. So I have learned from him a little bit of how you should think as reviewers or as editor, because ultimately when publishing, those are the 4 people that matter. Eventually when it gets published, you got to think about others, or when it gets close to publishing. So you got to think in terms of what will make these people get attention. And editors, even though they want rigor and stuff, ultimately they're looking for papers that will get cited a lot, because that's how they are measured. So if you can somehow show in the first few paragraphs that this is a paper that will be read by a lot of people, or people will take notice, then they are likely to buy it and overlook some of the deficiencies that the editors are always critical. The reviewers are always critical. They're going to say this is a lousy paper. In fact, one person who I know, he was even a colleague of mine at University of Iowa. Later on, he was one of the reviewers. I know he was one of the reviewers. He wanted to ding it until the 3rd round. It's only because Michael Houston, who was the editor, who didn't know much about this paper, I said, oh boy, this paper, if it's published, it's going to get a lot of citations and stuff. So it's going to be to my credit. So it's it's a political game that you play in the publishing world, whether we like it or not. And this person knows how to play, Jerry Tullis knows how to play that game in terms of positioning the product in a nice way. It's not. So it ended up as analysis of, there's a lot of, it's got fairly good citations, and it was a finalist for the Odell. So what I learned from this master position, well, no, before that, just to show you how active he is, which are some of the things that I learned from him, working with him. If you look at here's a 31-page resume. I think the longest, he could probably go to the Guinness Book of World Records, is the longest resume by an academic. That's because he writes all the conference proceedings that he's gone to and stuff. Of course, he's got good stuff, and he's got over 100 papers. I have about 30 papers that I worked with 20 co-authors. So I'm just explaining 6 of them or 5 of them. He has 4 children, so he's productive in many ways. But the thing about, he always works in a den now he's in California. But the moment I send out to him my review or something, now in fact, one of my co-authors is after me almost a month. I haven't replied, and I didn't work on the paper that Paco and Johan sent for almost a year. But that's not the way to success, actually. If you think something will click, you got to, as an author, which I learned, you got to be prompt, as prompt as you can be. And he was always prompt. He was juggling a lot of balls in some sense, 4 or 5 papers. A lot of people wanted to work with him, but he was good at knowing exactly what will gel. So he's got, and because he's a master position, I've written 3 papers with him. All 3 papers were either winners or runner-up for awards. So somehow being associated with him, he knows exactly how to get a paper noticed. We are trying to write a sequel to this paper, 1991, because every 25 years you can churn the same thing, add some new data, and people will hopefully look at it. At least you can try. So what I learned is that positioning is so important. You may have a great paper technically or empirically, but you have to know, simply because the competition for papers in good journals has become very, very intense. So just being right in what you say is not going to cut it. You have to be right, and you have to be impactful. And impactful is really about how you position the paper. The second that I learned from him is, you always have, which I learned from a lot of co-authors, a lot of my senior co-authors, most of the people I worked were successful. So I've picked the ones who are successful, and they had a hunger for research. They were always, not always, but most of the time thinking about research and what they could do, no matter. And you need to multitask. And he's now 65 or something. He's still after me. Sometimes I run away from him at conferences because he's saying, okay, why don't we work on the sequel to that paper? So especially at my age now, some of those things are starting to make sense to me. The third one, which actually Jacqueline presented, the Raju paper, this was also somewhat coincidental, or serendipity, as they say. And this was a marketing science conference at St. Louis. It was a very popular session. I don't know who it was presenting, Jack Sheth or something. I don't know if you know Jagdish Sheth. He's a thinker, marketer. It was standing room only, and I was standing, and suddenly one guy elbows me out and takes my place. Who's this guy? And that was this big guy called Jagmohan Raju. I said, oh, this guy looks familiar. So we start talking, and it turns out that we became friends in need. He had a paper on national brand private label. He's an extremely smart individual. And he had sent it to JMR in 1991. We're talking several years ago. And that got rejected. I had at the same time sent my thesis paper to marketing science, and after 2 rounds, that got rejected. And so we decided to pull those 2 papers together. Just while we were at that session, I said, okay, maybe why don't you send me your paper, I will send you my paper. And this is the kind of analytics that he had developed. Now, I also tried to do this, and then after it got too complicated for me, I said, I can't deal with it. But he said, don't worry about it. Ultimately, you can extract some juice from it. Don't think just because it is initially complex, don't give up early. I mean, you may have to give up at some point in time, but don't give, and that's the same thing for empirical modeling too. There are sometimes you have to run 100 to 200 models to get that model that will work for you, or that will make the most sense, or that will be edible to the reviewers. So acceptable to the reviewers. So it's a lot of publishing or research that leads to top journal publishing is grunt work. It's 90%, this notion that 90% perseverance, what's it called? Efforts, 90% perseverance and 5% or 10% luck or 10% is not wrong, even in the so-called academic research. A lot of it is just bull work, getting a lot of data or grinding through analytical models. So I learned that from him. So we submitted it to management science, because my paper got rejected in marketing science, his paper got rejected in JMR, so we couldn't send it to those two journals. And the only other journal was management science. And it turns out the area editor of management science and marketing was Raju's colleague at Wharton. He was at that time, he was in UCLA first, he went to, and then the associate editor, so the marketing area editor passes it on to associate editor, who was my friend Deepak Jain. Says that, boy, this is going to be really easy for us. We got, and this is a political game. Now we got two people who like us, who know us, and so it should be, but when we got the reviews, boy, it was brutal. I mean, we thought we had written a really nice paper. It was just like, oh my God, I want to hide my face somewhere if I were writing this paper. But that's when I was almost, not giving up, I was very frustrated, because I was a young, relatively younger professor at the time, and this was my thesis paper, and people are, hurling bricks at this thing. Already I got, after 2 rounds, I got rejected in marketing science, and then we sent it to management science, and at least there was a revision. And that's why these days, I was telling somebody, I'm working on a paper that is a reject and resubmit. I've worked on it for 5 years. It's a brand equity paper where I'm going again against Ailavadi Lehman's measurement of brand equity's revenue premium. And that was, I know Ailavadi was one of the reviewers, and she rejected it, obviously. But the editor, Priyas Desai, gave me a reject and resubmit. And I said, oh, right, reject and resubmit. And then everybody is saying, wow, you got rejected, congratulations. Even reject and resubmit is a good thing these days in top journals. That means at least they've given you. I thought R&R meant revise and resubmit. They say R&R now includes reject and resubmit. You got to try your hand. So it is becoming harder. I mean, I don't want to, so we worked on each point by point, and then eventually, after 3 years, it got published, and it won the Best Paper Award for the, a year later, it won the Best Paper. And that's when I found Raju's comments. So he was asked to receive the award on our behalf and make a short speech. And at that time, he said, we were simply, I was gracious enough to say that we were simply the pens that wrote the paper. It's the reviewers. In fact, if you see, we saw our original version of the paper and the final version that was published, and we thought we were smart guys. And there was another guy, that some of you may know, who was a third co-author called Sanjay Dar, who is at Chicago. He's an extremely smart guy. Now, I'm the dumb guy in that group in that sense. And all of us thought we wrote a really good paper originally, but the final paper was like night and day. Now, after we saw the final paper, I said, how did we get to write the initial paper? So sometimes the reviewers really do a good job. If the process works as it should, and if you take it in the right spirit, and if you implement it, and the reviewers and editors work, editors work with you, the review process can actually eventually be a good thing, even though ultimately we always complain about the reviewers. So he said we were the pens that wrote the paper, that editors and reviewers were the ones who finished it, or who actually, which I thought was really giving them more credit than what they deserve, but at least it was gracious. So that's what I learned. Two big things I learned working with him in the mid-90s, or early 90s actually. It was published in 95, we worked in 91 to 93, is don't panic if you encountered some difficulty in the approach. You have to persist and don't be put off. Use reviewer comments positively to revive your paper, if possible. If it's, okay. Doesn't mean I follow all of what I'm saying or what I've learned, but at least it tells me that these are paths to success in publishing. The fifth author, I guess this is the fifth author or fourth. This was Sinu Srinivasan, and I talked about this and maybe some others. This was started the idea was started in 89 when a theory called asymmetric price tier effect by Blattberg and Wisniewski. And briefly, I talked about it in my paper on promotion elasticity. The idea was that there is asymmetry in switching. National brand consumers will switch to store brands. Store brands consumers won't switch to national brand because it imputes lower quality, and therefore national brand cross price elasticity will be higher, and store brands cross price elasticity of attracting national brand consumers will be lower. So that was something that seemed to make a lot of intuitive sense. So everybody accepted it. It's like Newton's law. Until, I mean, I don't want to elevate ourselves to that level, until Einstein came along. And after Einstein, Stephen Hawking, I don't know if you've seen Theory of Everything, he had a different proposal about the beginning and end of the world and so forth. So this was considered Newton's law in the sense that, it cannot be wrong. But somehow I always felt that so their final verdict was national brand should promote, store brand should not promote. They got to keep low price, but they shouldn't do anything else. But in the real world, you find a lot of store brands promoting, either discounting or display featuring and so forth. And then so we tell them, oh, why are they doing it? Well, that means they're wrong. The theory is right, they are wrong. So we wanted to attack it from different perspectives, margin perspective, profit perspective, and response perspective. And somehow I felt that this cross-price effect may or may not be holding. So I was thinking about it, working on it, mulling over it. Sometimes you have to mull over ideas or papers for 2, 3, 4 years before it even gets into some written form. So my point was that depending on whether you measure it as elasticity or absolute effect, how it's measured will dictate asymmetry. So I presented this paper in a marketing science conference, and I didn't even know Sinu was attending. He's always very quiet. He stays in one corner, just observes. He doesn't ask a lot of questions or make a lot of noise in terms of showing his presence. But later he gave me he said, I enjoyed your paper, which means he's going to come up with a lot of criticism. And he said, these are the things that I don't like about your paper, or the problems with your paper. So I know of him. I didn't know him very well. I know he's a nice person. He's he founded conjoint analysis practically. Green, I don't know if you know another professor called Green and Srinivasan are the ones who actually, conjoint analysis is one of the few techniques that marketers can take. We are primarily, in terms of techniques, we are borrowers. We borrow from sociology, psychology, economics, statistics, to some extent mathematics. But conjoint is the one where Others are borrowing from us, and that's because of Green and Srinivasan. He was a professor at Stanford, Green was professor at Wharton. So I knew him from conjoined times, and suddenly he was poking his nose in an area in which he has actually not worked much, but he's just a very, someone who can think. So I wanted to get rid of him, so I said, why don't you be my co-author? Hoping he'll say no, and then get out of there. He said, why not? So it was purely he caught me by surprise when he said he agreed to be a co-author. So we worked on it, and that's when I saw how disciplined he was in terms of how, in fact, those days, there was no email or there was no, so we had to literally send our paper physically, and they used to mark on the side. And so at the margin, he had such neatly written comments. There were no scratches, no. So even before he wrote, he had thought about all the comments. And that was not to say, okay, be neat in your research, but he was giving me a signal, Raj, don't goof up. Don't mess things up with your sloppy work. So he was trying to tell me that you got to be right in what you say first, and then you got to make sure that that is impactfully delivered. So we won't go into the details of this. It got published as the other thing that, so whenever especially here we were trying to attack an established paradigm, which was asymmetric price tier effect. So I couldn't have done it myself. Doyle Kim was my PhD student. I couldn't have done it myself. So by just adding Sinu, who had a lot of recognition already, it was more palatable. Now, that was one way that we countered it. And second was, you can't frontally attack most of the things that have already been published, because it goes against the editor who's made it. It goes against that journal itself. So you have to say it is a good theory, but it has to be refined this way. So we added something called a neighborhood neighborhood theory. We added our own theory which is, no, I shouldn't say theory, that brands that are priced close to each other compete the most when promoting. And brands that are farther apart actually compete less with each other, whether they're national brands or store brands. So if Kellogg were to worry about something, they have to worry about Post or General Mills brands than a store brand, and vice versa. And so that they said, oh, okay, at least you're adding something to the pile. So it got published. And so what I learned from him was simple. Be as meticulous as you can be in all details of your research. And the last one that I want to, he just retired as of May 30th. So just 2 weeks ago, this person retired. He's a person he's the reason I joined SMU Cox business. He was a professor, colleague of mine for 20 years. And he's the reason I stayed at Cox. He's such a fun colleague to be in. And he has interesting ideas, and then he goes to somebody and says, okay, let's develop this. So I'm a worker bee. There are some queen bees and there are some worker bees. So he's a queen bee in the sense that he'll get an idea and stuff, good interesting ideas, and then let others work on it. And then he'll come and finish things up. He was a good position too. So he had an idea that if we can show the relationship, because brand equity, which is another thing, brand equity is the best way that marketers can justify their expenditure. That's the only way that we can, and that's a fight. It's called ROMI. Some of you may know, return on marketing investment. A lot of people say it's not ROMI, it's ROME. That is return on marketing expenditure. And it's a big difference strategically when you ask for money in the corporate world. If you think of it as an expenditure, it's going to be expensed in that year. If you think of it as an investment, then you can say you can appropriate that expenditure or that money over time. And some people think advertising is an investment, but no CFO or CEO is going to accept advertising as an expenditure, investment. So the way you're going to do that is to say, okay, advertising increases brand equity. Brand equity has a long-term effect, and therefore advertising is an investment. People still don't buy it. So he said, well, if we can relate brand equity to company stock market, which the CEO is really worried about, or that's what they are judged by, then if we can say as brand equity increases, your stock value increases, then that may be a better way of justifying marketing as an investment. I mean, we haven't gotten that far. So we tried to get 100 companies' market to book value, which is the stock value, and the company's brand value from, I don't know which source that we use, Brand Z by Millward Brown. I don't know if you heard of that. So we tried to relate it, and we found a positive, non-linear relationship. We published it in Journal of the Academy of Marketing Science, where it actually won as one of his, that, I don't know if you have it, yeah, it won the Best Paper Award in the Journal of Academy. It was the lead article, not because we did something sophisticated. In fact, it was very low level of sophistication in the empirical model. But we were one of the first to display it or to produce that result in marketing. So the two ways to publish. You want to be one of the first to come up with an idea and execute it, or you have to be sophisticated and provide some incremental contribution. In this case, it gotten because it was one of the first. But the reason I wanted to say was, unlike others who are asking, what ideas you have and whether you've been rigorous, this person, whenever he was working, he asked me one question: Raj, are you having fun working with me on this research? And it's funny the way things have evolved, especially in this digital world. Some of the co-authors, I don't even know whether it's a male or a female, so by the name, or that's how remote we have become in working with our co-authors. Sometimes we have 10 co-authors, and 3 of them you don't even know who they are. So he is suggesting, he was always saying, you should have fun doing research, and you should use research as a way of socializing in a good way, getting to know those people, so we used to kind of use this, draw different curves, find out think about what part of the human anatomy it represents, and so forth. So it's just a way of making light of, because sometimes research can be quite dreary. So unless you enjoy working with your that's an added bonus if you can enjoy working with your co-author and not be purely interested, okay, how do I get this out as quickly as possible? So that's something that was new to me, because I was very professional in my approach to working on papers. But he said, you got to provide a human element to working on papers. So the main thing that I learned from him is have fun doing research. And that's sort of the last wisdom that I'm going to present. So in summary, in terms of manuscript preparation, these are the 5 pearls of wisdom that I got working with my co-authors. Whenever you start, you have to have some end goal in mind. That may not be the final end goal, or the end goal itself may slightly change. In analytical work, that's something that you can, and don't panic. It's always good. There is going to be some roads. In fact, if it is not difficult, someone else has already done it. Or if it's not difficult, it's not saleable. Because they say, oh, everybody knows this, it's simple. So it, by its nature, has to be somewhat difficult. And that's why academics are a totally different type of human beings. Academics are a different breed, because we have to love the research we do. You can't survive or succeed in this field unless you love what you're doing. If 30 years back, When I was working for Exxon, if someone had asked me, oh, are you going to be a professor 5 years, I would have laughed at them. Being a professor was the last on my mind when I was working. Even after I came to Kellogg, I wanted to do a terminal 1-year master's and jump ship and go join a research company. So the only reason I came to do a PhD was to get into US. So then I can find some. Then once I got there, I said, whoa, this is fun. And you know what? There's no boss. I don't have a boss. I don't have someone who's watching whether I come in at 8 a.m. and leave at 6 p.m. and someone who can hire and fire me. If, of course, the tenure process is a different matter. And also, I understood the importance of being both meticulous and position the paper. On the review process, oops. Oh, what's previous here? Anterior? Okay. So I learned a new Spanish word now. Previous is anterior. So constructive, it's a very hard thing because I would have probably sent about 50 papers, and 30 of them, or more than 30 of them, may have been rejected. I mean, I've published 30, well, including I'm saying 50 papers that have been rejected. But rejection is part of the game, is the name of the game. But it takes some time, and sometimes you don't want to get all rejects and constructive criticism, you always have to encourage people to look at your paper if you can and criticize if it's possible. Sometimes everyone is busy, as busy as you are, so they say, well, I don't have time. But if we can find some people, so reviewer comments as well as constructive criticism is a good thing. And the last one, on a personal basis, you have to have some hunger for research to be successful. Let me go one by one so that, well, this is for me, not for you guys. You're never old for doing research. Multitasking, if you can. I can't multitask. I usually have worked on one paper at a time. I try to finish as much of it, even if it takes a month, go on to the next paper. And they say you're a loser. Yeah. That you've got to work on 2 or 3 papers and be able to juggle it in order if you want to have because you don't know which one is going to ultimately end in the pipeline and go to the final process. So maybe it's best to work on at least 2 or 3 papers, but I won't overdo it. There are some people like Don Lehman, who's he can work on 10 papers and he can succeed in 8 of those 10 papers. We're not like that. We're just average human beings. So multitasking is something that you want to think about. I would encourage you to have fun doing research with your co-authors. So these were the 6 people that I passed on the wisdom I learned, hopefully to you. But then the question is, if these are wisdom, what's knowledge? And this notion of knowledge and wisdom, I'll end with 3 of these slides. So what is knowledge and what's wisdom? Now, wisdom alone is not going to let you publish. Wisdom is something that comes from the exterior, and this is knowledge is, so you got to have knowledge first, and you combine it with wisdom to take it wherever you want to go. So if you think about knowledge as a car, wisdom is the road that paves the way to the road. So, and if you think of knowledge, this is my own analogies, basket of fruits, wisdom is a blender. So you need some wisdom to get the final product to the shape that it wants. But if you don't have knowledge, or if you don't have the basic content, then whatever wisdom you have is not going to, because there's nothing to develop the wisdom around. And if you think of knowledge as a brain, wisdom is a body that makes it whole. So if wisdom is what I try to share with you in this particular session, knowledge is what you're trying to convey and acquire through this conference. So good luck to you all, since I know that I'm going to be leaving tomorrow. So good luck to you. I enjoyed this conference. Thank you. And if you have any questions, I'll be happy to answer them. Do you have any questions? Are you good? Good. Okay. Thank you. Thank you. Yeah.
I just wanted to say something, not
That's an interesting question.
Doing now. So probably these guys here, and I know something, and they're like older, like how a guy who's a top guy can dedicate you, spend time, dedicate you time, even though these guys are super busy. When you try to contact them and all that, so that's what you did also with that. So what I'm trying to say is that it's very important to have. Maybe that's not so significant to get published in very good journals, but it's significant to get acknowledged
Uh-huh.
from the human side
Right.
by your colleagues.
I think that's, so I was in that sense maybe lucky to some extent, and everybody, and I mean not directly related to, it's like a Maslow's hierarchy in the sense that there is a Maslow's hierarchy of life as an academic. I don't know how many of you know Maslow's hierarchy, which is in the bottom is what's it called, it's survival, and then now I forget exactly the ones. So at the top is self-actualization, at the bottom is survival, and in between are 2 or 3 phases. So as a young professor, you're trying to publish and survive. As you go up the hierarchy to self-actual, which is where I think I am, or I want to be, let's say, and that's where many of those people, they even attain that early. They want to help. So my goal is and that's what in the last 2 years, is to work with people outside of the US where there is a lot of data. They're probably not as attuned to at least the way academic research is quite rigorous in the US. So mingle with some of the people. I'm working on a couple of papers in India and a paper or 2 here through this on private label, simply because I know that. So to impart some of the knowledge as well as the wisdom that I have learned by working with some people here. So that's so you have to find the right people who you think would be best in terms of knowledge and wisdom providers, and through that associate.
Yeah, I'm going to make my point clear here is that, the young papers and publications, and this is something that if I had to point out something about you, it would be some, of course, you're a very smart guy and all that, but it's not the first characteristic I point out about you, but your generosity and your human
Yeah,
qualities
yeah,
and all that.
yeah.
So what I'm trying to say is that that's something very important also
Yes.
beyond,
Yeah.
trying to get published. So
I agree. I agree.
that's why probably these guys hand you over that kind of wisdom, but maybe because they have those kind of emotional intelligence-related characteristic,
Yes.
spiritual characteristic,
Yes.
which make them spend time on others.
Yes.
Right?
Yes.
So this is what you're doing now with that.
Correct.
So I think
Correct.
it's important also to
I see your point.
that out. So I think for that, and I hope also that we will remember that being considerate to others, generous to the small people. You said that, big people, small people, because I met with some guys very, kind of these guys publish in top journals, as you do, but with the opposite, the human values.
Yeah. Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
So that's
Some people
sad,
wouldn't look
that's
at you.
sad,
I can name a couple of guys who I showed here. They wouldn't give you the time of day. That's just their personality. They would give it only if they think they benefit from it. So the different ways that people join you, either they benefit from it, they think there may be some synergy, or they are gracious, or free, or not free, at least generous with their time. So those are the 3 types of people. And there are different models of success. There's, one of the guys I showed here, you can't talk to him. he will look down upon you like, you know, you're a rabbit or something, you're some animal.
All right, so see, that's another point I would have highlighted to be important also, you know,
Yeah.
to be considerate and all that to others. So
I think that's a good point.
I don't know how these people are. Well, I had some contact with one of them, and it was very good. But I know how you are, and I value that a lot. So
Oh, thank you.
on behalf of the organization, everybody here, I would like to thank you for your generosity and being that good person, apart from being an excellent scholar. And I just wanted to point out that because
Okay,
you
well,
served it, and because I think that we, as we develop our careers, should have that in mind.
Yeah. Eventually, we hope that when you all get here, and that's how, you know, parental role models and stuff. I'm not saying I'm a parent or something, but you imbibe some qualities of the people you respect or admire, and then eventually, when you all, you know, become senior and produce and stuff. I know already some of you. Someone was saying they are looking at PhD thesis. So already some of you are, you know, guiding PhD students and stuff. Those are ways in which you are actually providing service. And if that extends and goes beyond sharing and to sharing knowledge and wisdom, we only talked about wisdom. Sometimes sharing knowledge is as important as sharing wisdom. Yeah, that's true. Hopefully some of you will be in a stage and talking about it 15, 20 years from now that I have done today.
So we'll talk about you.
Yeah, okay. Well, thank you.